to ensure fairness in gambling dispute resolution.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? So I'd like to first welcome to the stage a group of specialists, Duncan, myself. We go back. We've had a couple of back and forths as an ADR. Tânia, legal representative. I know you've got experience with the land-based models as well. Max, CEO at Sigma Play, and Marianna, Tavella, legal counsel in a number of different firms, but Sigma as well. So today's a really interesting topic, and when Sigma asked me, do you want to moderate this one? I said, yes, this is definitely one I want to jump on, especially having argued with Duncan a few times in the past. Basically, I just want to explain for those of you that don't know, what is an ADR, alternative dispute resolution? Ultimately, what we're talking about is a framework that protects players, and in some cases operators, to ensure before raising that legal bar, before there is a more serious dispute, there is an intermediary to support, player dispute and some other subjects which we're going to touch on today. I think we have, 25 minutes, so we'll go into it a little bit. But I want to kick off with one thing super interesting. I want to get the opinion on the other side, because as an operator, we always say, the ADR is just there to work against us, but it's not the case, is it? So Duncan, your opinion, why is an ADR needed?
Gambling industry is pretty unique in business in that gambling operators can deliver exactly the product that a player is expecting, that a player has purchased, and still have the player end up unhappy with the service that's been delivered. For that reason, there's a far higher rate of disputes within the gambling sector than there are in other areas of business. The court systems are overloaded and inaccessible for a lot of consumers. So we need to build trust with consumers, with players, by facilitating an easier road to managing any friction that occurs between the operator and the consumer.
Fantastic. I mean, that's really it. And we used to have this word, I think you've also used it for me in the past, and I'm going to admit it, predatory terms, right? I think it really comes down to your brand and how you want your brand to be perceived in the market. If a player doesn't agree with those terms, they have a framework to visit to say, I feel I've been cheated. I feel this brand hasn't supported me. Tânia, you've also worked in the land-based operation. How does it differ? Do you actually see such cases in land-based?
Well, I've been working with land-based casinos back in Asia, and now I'm based in Europe, so I work with online. And from the mechanist perspective, we have the land-based, we don't have ADR. All the conflicts pass through the regulator and go straight to court when needed. So what I feel is the need to implement these kind of systems, allowing the client to have a faster decision, a cheaper decision, because this is important. Sometimes we are dealing with high rollers, sometimes we are dealing with small players, and sometimes people don't have the resources to go to court. So it's important to have an intermediate stage where you can still be heard, you can still present your proof, and get the decision faster.
So that's really interesting, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit with the land-based model, because, I mean, is it correct that a land-based casino has the right to decline a customer? They can actually say, we don't actually want your business anymore, regardless of how much the customer has lost. This is a common practice in the land-based market. I mean, how is this perceived? Is there any framework for a customer to go, wait, I lost 10,000 euros yesterday, I won 20 today, and now I've been thrown out?
Well, you have the regulator, and in Macau, the regulator is very active, it's very strong, and controls all the business. So it's easy for a player to complain on that, and the land-based operator will be in trouble. There's a limited number of licenses, it's highly regulated, no one wants to put their license at danger, so I think...
So it is quite strict for the land-based. Next, I want to shift over to you. I know that you've recently, if I'm not mistaken, completed the ADR application. Walk us through it a little bit. I mean, what are the kind of hurdles? How do you become an ADR?
So thank you for your question. That's a very good question. So I believe that the whole industry needs an ADR, not just the operators, not just the players, all of them together. An ADR builds trust and it enhances fairness, but also creates shifts from having a negative experience to a positive one with an operator. What we did at Sigma is we created a platform which is very easy to use. Platform where the player can come, share their concern. It doesn't have to be a dispute. Then we take it all over from there, and we ensure that everything is handled in a fair, timely manner. And this is all basically what the players were looking for. And it's much more cost effective than going through court actions and so on.
Fantastic. So just out of curiosity, because here we're more on the ADR scene and Marianna at the end, legal scene. I mean, your take in the case of an ADR not resolving a situation like that, I mean, is it within the player's interest to, let's say, reach out to a lawyer? I know the earlier panel said get a lawyer, but I think that was more B2B focused. But in your case, how do you perceive taking legal action against an operator? I know it's not, let's say, your current focus, but is that something that you believe will actually become more present in especially unregulated markets? For you, Marianna, just a bit of a brief on how does a player reach out to a lawyer and says, I want to sue this casino?
I guess now it's more relevant to go through arbitration and ADR services rather than courts against the operators. The pool of players who may have grievance against the operators is quite large, and this means that through regulators who now impose an obligation on operators to offer free arbitration services to players, it means that players from any financial status are able to go against an operator for a dispute, whereas with courts, not everyone can afford to go to courts. And also, it is in the favor of operators to have this option rather than courts, because going to courts could be time-consuming, very costly, and they could go for years. So they spend years in all court procedures and litigation, and this really harms the reputation of operators.
So that's quite an interesting, and I'm going to change the gear onto terms a little bit, but you just reminded me of something. I've seen cases, and you've been there as well, where we've seen operators who are ultimately responsible to the player, but the fault isn't always on the operator, is it? There are cases that we know of that the fault is actually on the slot provider, but it is the operator who's responsible. I mean, is it a case where the player needs to sue the operator and the operator needs to sue the slot provider? Because it's always ultimately the operator who's giving service, right? What is your take on indemnity over there? Is that something that should be pushed onto that slot provider?
It's all about contractual protections, really. It's what agreements you have with the slot provider and what agreements you have with the operator. It is quite strange, because normally you would want a relationship between the slot provider and the operator, which is not the case. So therefore, you have to include the indemnities, and you have to include how you have to handle those claims into the contract. So it depends on the bargaining power and what you agree on to the contract.
As an operator and a platform operator, it is one of our daily pet hates, going through slot provider contracts, and they're all saying, I'll indemnify you up to 100K, and we're like, but your slots can pay out $1 million. That doesn't help me at all. But Duncan, I want to shift over a little bit. We spoke about it. Predatory terms. I think that's quite an interesting subject, and I think when you're building your brand, it's something you need to keep in mind, right? If you're instilling terms in your brand that are there to purely protect the operator in the case of even just a winning player, then you are building a predatory brand. What's your take on at what line do you draw for players to, let's say still be attracted but not get screwed over, in all fairness?
There's a balance to be found here. A lot of operators will write their contractual terms on the fundamental legal theory that if they write it down, it's legal. Certainly within more regulated markets, that's not the case. We have consumer protection laws, we have contract laws, fairness laws that have to be adhered to. The ADR's role in this is to assess the terms and determine whether they are viable, whether they would stand up to a robust legal examination or whether they are falling short of the legal standards necessary to be enforceable. Aside from that, though, yes, you're absolutely right, Oliver. When you are writing terms that allow you to, for instance, pay out a progressive jackpot of over €1 million at a rate of €5,000 a month, perception of that term is never going to be positive. Your players might not read it, but when it happens, it will become a big story and it will damage your brand if you are seen to try and enforce this.
So that's a really interesting concept. And also as a white label provider, I mean, hands up, when I'm running a white label, I tell that white label, you've got to decide what you want your brand to be.
Yeah.
Do you want to be a VIP brand? Do you want to have maximum monthly payouts of €100,000? You need to ensure that you have the liquidity for that, because it goes both ways, right?
Absolutely.
We've seen time and time again where operators hit mega jackpots, or players on operators hit mega jackpots, and they simply don't have the liquidity to pay it. So I think there are cases where terms will protect the operator not to go out of business, because ultimately, if that operator does go out of business, the player's getting nothing, right? So it's a balance between the two, and I think we have to kind of find at what point is it, okay, if we're going to allow you to gamble big, you're going to get a big payout, you know? Maybe the, let's call it the legal framework, can instill certain multipliers that actually make sense.
You certainly, I mean, you've seen restrictions placed by regulators in various markets. Certainly within Malta, I know that the MGA won't support an operator paying out. The rule of thumb is it has to be appropriate, it has to be relative to the size of the win. So if you've allowed €1 million win and you say you're going to pay out at €5,000 a month, and that gets back to the regulator will not support your position. But that said, the Maltese regulations around this are woolly. They're open to interpretation. So the balance for the operator has to be to try and pick, to assess cases individually and make sure that their approach to the management of a player is going to be viewed as reasonable by the regulator. And when you take an approach that's viewed as reasonable by the regulator, the chances are most players are going to view it as reasonable as well. It protects your brand.
Well, that's exactly it. And I want to do one more round before I go into which regulators want what ADRs, because that's also a good one. But Tânia, what about land-based? I know a lot of your background is land-based, but you're in online as well now, right?
Yeah, now I'm more with online in Portugal, not as much in Asia.
But what's your take on the framework of operators simply not being able to pay out players? Because it does happen more often than not.
Well, coming from Portugal, it's a highly regulated market where the operators, in order to get a license, need to provide security bonds. So,
like Estonia is very high on
the
that.
players are protected in that way because the regulator easily will go to those bonds if necessary to compensate any kind of player. So I think that's more or less. But yeah, if the operator doesn't have enough money to pay their players, so I think it's only fair.
Nobody gets anything, right?
I think this is a matter of trust. We need to trust because we are when a player enters a casino or an online gaming website, they are entering into a contract. So both parties need to comply with the terms of the contract.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually, and that's what I wanted to jump into next. Max, I want to start with you because I mentioned this to Duncan earlier as well, that there are markets that do require an operator, even myself, to say, I have to list my ADR immediately. I'm not getting my application through. But how are you seeing that play out in different markets? I mean, the largest market in the online gambling world today is still Curaçao. I'm saying non-regulated, right? I think it really comes down to also choosing your license, but how are you finding your ways around the regulators?
So we've developed a platform for players where they can come and solve their issues. Not all of the issues have to become disputes or legal disputes. What players need, they want to bridge the gap between operators and them. And if we bridge the gap by having a platform, an easy-to-use platform, it's a win-win for the whole industry. I think somehow what we're trying to do here is help fix the industry and bridge the gap. We all keep talking about retention, and this is how you build retention, by building trust and loyalty to the players. Now, how do we navigate through different regulations? In Curaçao, there is still not an official ADR, but but that doesn't mean that we cannot solve the problems. Casinos and sportsbook, the operators in general, they are very responsive to our platform. If there is a complaint for something which is very well, let's say, explained, the operator gets a notification and they reply really quickly. And most of the disputes, most of the complaints are solved in a timely manner without the need of involvement of a legal counselor. So,
Sorry, go on, Max, if you want to finish.
no, that's okay. Well, basically, what the players needed is just a platform to bridge the gap. And that already solves 90% of the problems.
So that's really interesting, and you also touched on it before, Duncan, and I want to switch this over from a legal perspective. I have a simple question on this. Is signing up to a casino some kind of legal binding agreement? Marianna?
Of course it is. It's like, since there are terms and conditions, you sign up for those, right? Now, whether the terms and conditions are enforceable or are deemed unfair, that's a different story, but it is a contractual agreement.
So that kind of goes both ways, right? Because you can have a scenario where the operator says, hey, these are my terms and conditions, you signed up to this, I'm going to give you 5,000 euros a month. But if it doesn't coincide with the regulator, then is it a legal dispute to say, okay, so the terms and conditions are null and void? One more question on this one, Maria. So at what point does it void that agreement? Does it mean that the whole agreement is null and void? Or is it just that clause?
There are consumer protections in place, and that's in most jurisdictions in the world. So yes, if a contract is deemed to be so unfair to the consumer, it could even be regarded void, the whole contract. So it's not about, yes, you can put whatever you want in the terms and conditions, but then you have to be careful, otherwise your contract could be void.
That's interesting. I mean, it's the question I always had. It's like, as an operator, we review our terms quite often. And when a white label comes into the market, we do tell them, listen, if this is your maximum, keep it for casual players. Keep your bet limits low. Don't promise big wins. Don't put €1 million on your main banner. It needs to balance out. But Duncan, here's a question for you. I think about this a lot. If a player is coming into the market and they're actively choosing to, because I'm switching gears now to protect the operators a bit, but if you're actually choosing, you're a player in Germany. How many players in Germany play on Curaçao casinos, right? You are actively choosing to go outside your own legal framework. How protected are you? Because you've got these ads, I'm sure you know about it now, in Germany and all these places. Did you ever gamble in 2016? We'll get your money back from them. I mean, if the player is actively going for those casinos, they are making a conscious decision. Do they have right to protection?
That's an interesting question, certainly. If we look at the UK market, we saw a report by the Betting and Gambling Council published a few weeks ago that highlighted that actually consumers have a very, very weak understanding of what a licensed casino is and what an unlicensed casino is. They don't know the difference. So certainly I would suggest that there is a large body of work that needs to be done in educating our consumer markets about regulation and about which casinos are legal and which are not legal. But once we cross that line of it's already happened, does the player have any rights to get their money back? That's going to very much depend on the laws and the legality in the individual country. We certainly, I mean, we see these sorts of disputes come in from German and Dutch players against MGA licensed casinos, and our response is always fairly standard. We're appointed as an ADR by the Malta Gaming Authority or the Maltese licensing system. And as such, we're only empowered to enforce the Malta regulations. So if the player's complaint is that it is illegal within Germany for them to have engaged with this particular operator, our response has to be you have to contact the relevant legal authorities in Germany to arbitrate that issue. It's beyond the remit of an ADR for the MGA.
So that's interesting, exactly. You need to contact your local authority to arbitrate that issue. It's really what it comes down to. I want to ask you a little bit on this one, Tânia, because, you know, looking at both markets, we've seen it a lot, right? And it goes both ways. There are abusive casinos, but there are abusive players. You know, let's talk about that a little bit, because I know I've had experience with players knowing that that casino is outside the legal zone, using a VPN, signing up to that casino. In the event that they lose the funds, they're like, okay, I'm going to take it to my local authority. I mean, I'm going to say this, but where is the ADR to protect the operator there?
Okay, so from my perspective, first of all, I come from a place where we don't have an ADR system. So we do have mediation in general and everything, but legal disputes, casino, iGaming disputes always go internally through the regulator or through courts. And some operators, because it's not standardized for all the operators. Each operator chooses what kind of protection, what kind of ADR will allow their customers to use. So I think standardized regulation is key. Then, regarding what you're saying about gray markets, we try to fight it. That's our main target, is to fight black markets, and we try to keep it, and by giving decisions publicly, making the process clear, establishing good procedures, making it public for everyone will make it easier for dispute regulation, and will also allow people to trust the regulated market. When you go to unregulated, well, you are not protected.
You're outside of the legal zone. It's like, sorry to be rude, but it's like buying, you know, whatever, a car at a quarter of the price on one of these dodgy Instagram adverts. You're ultimately taking that decision. But Mex, a little one on this one, because I know we're quickly running out of time, and this is a really good subject. But as an affiliate as well, we've spoken about this in the past. You tell players, hey, these brands don't accept players from these locations, but very often they can still see the offers. And you know as well as I do, players will use so many different means to sign up to a casino to get that bonus, whether it's a VPN, a false address. You know, as an affiliate, what can you do to avoid those situations?
So what we try to do is to give them an informed decision, a transparent, unbiased, informed decision. Our job as an affiliate is to give them the relevant casinos and explain that this casino accepts players from this and that country. You can still choose to do so, and they might do or may not do their KYC, which is on the operators themselves. But from our perspective, our main job is to ensure relevant and transparent and accurate information. And of course, because we have a platform, they can still come and complain to our ADR, and we will try to solve that complaint and in any kind of ways. And that's why we are building this. The ADR that we have built also helps us contribute to the industry in general, because we're collecting so much data and we're learning so much from players and the operators, which help then the operators build even more fair policies and transparent policies, and just improve the ecosystem overall.
Well, I mean, that's the goal, right? But we all know that, one of the biggest issues you have in the gaming market, and we talk about it, and Marianna, we'll go into this one because it's more about regulation now, that over-regulation leads to a black market, right? We're seeing this happen. I'm not going to say which LATAM country, but it's changing very quickly. But ultimately, from a legal perspective, Marianna, I know we touched on this, but how responsible is the player? How responsible are they? Because an operator can get in trouble for taking money from a player who's not supposed to be gambling there, but can a player get in trouble for giving money to an operator from a jurisdiction that shouldn't gamble?
Well, if it's illegal for the operator, it's also illegal for the player, right? So if that player breaches the law, which is if gambling is illegal in the country where he plays, then of course the player will also be responsible eventually. But the burden is always on the operator to make sure they have accessibility controls as to who plays into their platform. And it's always regarded like that.
Duncan, I know you want to jump in on this one, because we're running out of time. I want to hear your opinion.
Absolutely. Yes, there's certainly responsibility on both sides, but there's a fundamental difference between the consumer and the business. The consumer is not engaged in a commercial activity, they are just engaged in entertainment. The business is profiting from a potentially criminal activity. So yes, you will see, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but you will see some jurisdictions that will go after the consumer because they are simply easier to reach. But most jurisdictions take a more business-focused approach.
That's really interesting, actually. I mean, I've not heard of many cases. There's a couple of markets in the world like that have blanket bans, and you will get in trouble if you're a player and you gamble. But I think that time is, it's still quite new. And obviously, I do think the grey market is going to continue to flourish under over-regulation. That's my opinion. Look, we've run out of time. I can see us being hailed off stage. Trudy knows I like to keep going, but I just want to say thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Really insightful. Thank you, Sigma. It's been a great talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.